James Teller stepped off the shuttle's ramp and onto Xanthi's soil for the first time. The air had a sharp, almost metallic tang, not unpleasant but foreign enough to remind him he was no longer on Earth. The domed city ahead was illuminated by what looked like molten glass suspended in midair, each glowing orb lighting the translucent pathways and angular buildings that twisted upward into spirals. He adjusted his jacket nervously, his diplomatic uniform stiff and far too formal for a man used to being in the field. "Quite the view, huh?" A voice broke through James' thoughts. Turning, he saw Jackson Reed, his longtime friend and fellow envoy, lugging a large case over one shoulder. "You think these guys got beer?" Jackson grinned, though his sharp eyes scanned their surroundings for any hint of hostility. "Keep it together, Jackson," James replied, his voice low but steady. "We're here to make a good first impression, not to start a bar crawl." "Well, you're the one who wanted company," Jackson retorted. "Besides, I'm the comic relief." He elbowed James lightly. Two Xanthians approached, their long-limbed forms moving with a smooth, almost mechanical grace. Their gray-blue skin seemed to shimmer slightly under the artificial light. One was clad in a flowing garment that looked like liquid silver. The other, more austere, wore a utilitarian jumpsuit adorned with what James could only guess were rank insignias. "Envoys?" The one in silver said, their voice resonant and melodic. "I am Counselor Zidar. On behalf of the Xanthian Directorate, I welcome you to our world. This is Lissa, head of our security division." The more austere Xanthian, Lissa, nodded briskly but said nothing. James took a careful step forward and offered his hand in greeting, a gesture that seemed to puzzle the counselor. After a moment, Zidar extended a hand-like appendage, and their touch was cool and firm. "James Teller," he said, "and this is Jackson Reed." Jackson gave a half-salute with his free hand. "Glad to be here," he said casually. Zidar's head tilted slightly. "We have prepared quarters for you both. Please, follow me." As they walked through the city's winding pathways, James couldn't help but glance at Jackson. His friend was never one for subtlety, but he'd been a dependable partner through countless tense negotiations. If anyone could help lighten the mood in a place as alien as this, it was Jackson. "You think they've got some kind of interstellar Wi-Fi here?" Jackson muttered under his breath, earning a sharp glance from James. "Focus," James said quietly. Their accommodations were unlike anything they had seen before. A series of interconnected domes made from a translucent material that shifted colors in response to their movements. The interior was minimalist yet elegant, with curved furniture that seemed to adapt to the shape of whoever sat on it. "Comfortable," Jackson remarked, sitting on one of the chairs and grinning as it adjusted to his frame. "I hope it meets your needs," Zidar said. "We will reconvene tomorrow to begin discussions. Until then, please rest." James nodded. "Thank you, Counselor." As Zidar and Lissa departed, the two men settled into their quarters. Jackson immediately began poking around, inspecting the strange devices that served as entertainment consoles. James, meanwhile, unpacked his few belongings and pulled out his datapad to review the notes on Xanthian culture and customs. "Hey, James," Jackson called out from across the room. "You sure about this whole no backup thing? What if these guys aren't as friendly as they look?" James set the datapad down and looked at his friend. "That's why we're here, to prove we can build trust without an armed escort. Besides, if things go south, you've got my back. Right?" Jackson grinned. "Always." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft chime. A Xanthian voice echoed through the room, offering an automated welcome message and basic instructions on how to use the accommodations. "See," Jackson said, leaning back in his adaptive chair. "They're practically rolling out the red carpet. What could go wrong?" James smiled faintly but didn't answer. He knew better than to think it would be that simple. Chapter 2, First Contact. James Teller stood in the Xanthian research facility, feeling like the odd piece in a puzzle. The lab was vast, with walls of polished obsidian that reflected every light emitted by the crystalline machinery. A low hum resonated from all directions, like a pulse that guided the flow of energy through the building. Next to him, Jackson Reed leaned against a console, looking both impressed and bored. "Don't touch anything," James warned quietly, noticing his friend eyeing a glowing panel. Jackson raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, I'm just admiring the alien tech. You'd think they could have made the buttons a little more button-like, though. Perhaps it's not for pushing," came a voice from behind them. James turned to see a Xanthian scientist approaching, her silver-blue skin seeming to catch and reflect the light. She wore a fitted jumpsuit with faint, glowing patterns that shifted in intricate, flowing designs. "Lyra, I presume?" James asked, stepping forward and offering his hand. She studied the gesture, tilting her head slightly before placing her three-fingered hand in his. "You presume correctly, and you are James Teller, human envoy. Your records suggested you would be taller." "Sorry to disappoint," James replied dryly. "And this is Jackson Reed, also human," she said, glancing at Jackson. "Guilty as charged," Jackson said, grinning. "You're the tech wizard we're supposed to be working with, right?" "Wizard is a primitive term," Lyra replied, her expression neutral. "I am a data engineer and quantum theorist. But yes, I will be assisting you." "Great," James said, clearing his throat. "Let's get started. What's the first step?" Lyra turned and gestured to a nearby console. "You will need to understand the base mechanics of our energy transfer systems. This will allow you to interface your human equipment with our infrastructure." James nodded. "Sounds straightforward enough. Jackson, let's take a look." The three of them moved to the console, where Lyra began explaining the structure of Xanthian energy fields. Her explanation was precise, but the concepts were far from simple. James and Jackson exchanged occasional glances, each silently asking the other if they understood what she was talking about. "So, it's like a wireless power grid on steroids?" Jackson finally said. Lyra frowned. "Steroids are a type of human chemical substance, are they not?" "This analogy is unclear." "Just a figure of speech," James interjected quickly. "He means it's very advanced compared to what we have." Lyra nodded slowly. "In that case, the comparison is apartment." As the hours passed, the atmosphere shifted. At first, Lyra's responses were clipped and formal, her expressions difficult to read. But as James and Jackson asked more questions, some insightful, others utterly mundane, she began to respond with more patience. When Jackson joked about needing a Xanthian for Dummies guide, Lyra actually smiled, albeit faintly. "Your unpredictable sense of humor is an interesting trait," she remarked, glancing between the two men. "Is that a compliment?" Jackson asked, feigning shock. "It is an observation," Lyra replied evenly, though her lips twitched as if fighting another smile. By the time they took a break, the tension that had hung over their initial meeting had eased. James leaned against the console, looking out through the facility's curved windows at the alien cityscape beyond. "This place is something else," he said quietly. "You mean something else in a good way, right?" Jackson asked, stretching his arms. James smirked. "Yes, in a good way." Lyra approached, holding a crystalline tablet that displayed a holographic projection. "We have made significant progress today. You are grasping the fundamentals more quickly than I anticipated." "That's high praise coming from you," James said. Lyra tilted her head. "I simply state facts. However, your team dynamic appears to facilitate a faster learning process." "You hear that, James?" Jackson said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We're a dynamic duo." James shook his head, but he was smiling. "Let's just focus on the next steps." As they gathered around the console again, the sense of unfamiliarity began to fade. Lyra's once formal demeanor softened slightly, and the jokes and banter between the three of them became more natural. For the first time, James felt that their mission here might actually have a chance of succeeding. Chapter 3: Building Trust. James Teller and Jackson Reed stood at the edge of the Xanthian market district, taking in the bustling activity around them. The marketplace stretched out under the domed sky, filled with stalls made of polished crystal and glowing fibers. Traders hawked goods that shimmered, hummed, or even changed shape as they were held up for display. Xanthians moved smoothly through the throng, their long, graceful forms never bumping or jostling one another. Didn't think they'd have a farmer's market on another planet, Jackson joked, nudging James. It's not a farmer's market, James said, his eyes scanning the crowd. It's more like an open-air tech expo. You see that stall over there? He pointed to a vendor demonstrating a hovering device that floated in the air, emitting a soft golden light. I think that's a portable energy cell, worth more than the shuttle we came in on. You're telling me I could trade a battery for a spaceship? Jackson said, grinning. I like these guys already. Just don't try to trade for anything, James said. We're guests, not tourists. Their guide, Lyra, approached from a side street, her steps silent on the smooth, luminescent pavement. She carried a small, glowing container in her hands. I have acquired the materials you requested, she said, handing it to James. These should allow you to continue your analysis of our power conduits. Thanks, Lyra, James said. We were just admiring the market. Is it not too chaotic for your sensibilities? Lyra asked, tilting her head. Many Xanthians find the market's energy to be overwhelming. I wouldn't call it chaotic, James said. It's lively. Back on Earth, we have places like this, only less advanced. Yeah, Jackson added. No glowing food stands back home. Lyra's gaze shifted to the vendor James had pointed out earlier. That trader is known for his energy solutions. He could provide additional insight into our conduits, should you require it. James considered the suggestion, nodding. Good idea. Let's talk to him. As they approached the vendor, a sudden commotion erupted at the far end of the market. A small Xanthian child had stumbled into the path of a levitating transport pod. The driver shouted, trying to stop in time, but the pod hovered dangerously close to hitting the child. James! Jackson shouted, already moving. Without hesitation, James sprinted forward, reaching the child just as the transport came to a halt mere inches away. He scooped the little one up and carried them back to safety. A murmur spread through the crowd, and several Xanthians stepped forward, their expressions a mix of surprise and gratitude. The child's parent approached quickly, thanking James in a series of soft, melodic phrases. Lyra translated, her voice steady. She says you acted quickly. She is appreciative. It's nothing, James said, though his heart was still pounding. I just reacted. Your reaction was atypical, Lyra said, studying him. Most Xanthians would have waited for security to intervene. Jackson gave James a playful shove. You hear that? You're a hero now. Knock it off, James muttered, though he couldn't help but smile faintly. The market slowly returned to its normal rhythm, and James felt a shift in the atmosphere. Xanthians who had been watching them from a distance now seemed more at ease, their previously cautious glances replaced by nods of acknowledgement. Even the vendor they'd been approaching greeted them warmly. See, Jackson said, leaning in. You saved a kid, and now we're practically locals. Don't get carried away, James said, but he knew Jackson had a point. They were starting to earn trust, however unexpectedly. As the day went on, the three of them continued their tour, visiting different stalls and learning more about Xanthian technology and culture. Each new interaction felt smoother than the last, with Lyra offering explanations and even a few quiet jokes. By the time they returned to their quarters, the initial stiffness between the humans and their alien hosts had eased considerably. Not bad for a day's work, Jackson said, dropping into a chair that conformed instantly to his shape. You think they'll let us try some of that glowing food next time? James glanced at Lyra, who was reviewing notes on her tablet. We'll see. But first, let's make sure we can handle the technical side of things. If we can prove we're as capable as we say we are, it'll go a long way. Agreed, Lyra said. Today's events have shown that you adapt well. I believe we can make progress together. James nodded, already planning their next move. They had a lot of work ahead of them, but they also had a growing sense that they could meet the challenge, and maybe even thrive in it. Chapter 4. The Conspiracy. James Teller and Jackson Reed stood on the observation deck of the Xanthian Research Facility, gazing out at the glowing spires of the city. The air buzzed faintly with the hum of distant machinery, a constant reminder that Xanthi ran on technologies far beyond anything humanity had yet achieved. "This place still feels like a dream," Jackson muttered, leaning against the railing. "I mean, look at it. Floating towers, glowing sidewalks. It's like walking into a sci-fi movie." James smirked. "Yeah, it's something all right. Makes Earth feel a bit primitive by comparison." "Primitive's one way to put it," Jackson said, then glanced at James. "Think they're ever going to really trust us? I mean, we've been busting our butts trying to show we're not a threat, and I still catch them giving us sideways looks." "They'll come around," James replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's just going to take time. We're different from them. That's not an easy thing to overcome." "Different how?" Jackson pressed. "Because we crack jokes and don't have glowing skin? Because we're unpredictable." A voice interrupted from behind. They turned to see Lyra, her luminous patterns shifting subtly as she approached. She held a crystalline data tablet in one hand and a faint frown on her face. "Humans behave in ways that are difficult for Xanthians to anticipate," Lyra explained. "Your actions, particularly yours, James, do not follow the patterns we are accustomed to. It makes some of us uneasy." Jackson crossed his arms. "Well, maybe that's a good thing. Keeps you on your toes." Lyra tilted her head. "Perhaps, but it also complicates trust. Your species' capacity for rapid decision-making and improvisation can be both a strength and a source of concern." Before James could reply, the lights in the observation deck dimmed momentarily. The hum of the machinery seemed to falter, then resumed. Lyra glanced down at her tablet, her fingers moving swiftly. "That was not a scheduled fluctuation," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. James frowned. "What do you mean?" Lyra's patterns darkened slightly, a subtle but telling shift. "I mean, there was an unauthorized power draw from the central core. Someone accessed restricted energy channels without proper clearance." "Could it just be a malfunction?" Jackson asked, though he didn't sound convinced. "Unlikely," Lyra replied. "Our systems are designed to prevent accidental breaches. This was deliberate." James exchanged a look with Jackson. "So what do we do?" "We investigate," Lyra said simply. The three of them descended into the lower levels of the facility, their steps echoing softly in the silent halls. Lyra led the way, her tablet displaying a trail of energy signatures that she followed with unwavering focus. "I don't like this," Jackson murmured. "Feels too quiet." "Stay alert," James said, his voice steady. As they reached a maintenance corridor, the air grew cooler, and the lights flickered once more. Lyra stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. She pointed to a side door marked with glowing Xanthian symbols. "Inside," she whispered. James and Jackson followed her lead. The room was small, lined with rows of crystalline control panels. One of the panels was active, its display pulsing faintly. Standing in front of it was a Xanthian figure wearing a dark, unmarked jumpsuit. "You're not authorized to be here," Lyra said firmly. The figure turned, their face partially obscured by a hood-like covering. Without warning, they activated a small device on their wrist. The control panels dimmed, and an alarm began to sound. A low, rhythmic tone that echoed through the facility. "Stop!" James shouted, but the figure darted toward a hidden exit. Jackson moved instinctively, cutting off their escape. The intruder hesitated, glancing between the humans and Lyra. For a moment, the air was tense, the only sound the steady alarm. Then, with surprising agility, the figure lunged at Jackson. "Get back!" Jackson yelled, grappling with the intruder. James joined the struggle, and the two of them managed to disarm the figure, pinning them to the ground. Lyra quickly approached, pulling out a small device that emitted a soft pulse. The intruder went limp, unconscious. "What just happened?" Jackson asked, breathing heavily. "This individual attempted to siphon energy from the core," Lyra said, her voice calm but her patterns shifting rapidly. "And judging by their equipment, they were planning to use it for something outside of our authority." James stared at the unconscious figure. "A saboteur?" "Possibly," Lyra said. We need to report this immediately. As they secured the intruder and prepared to return to the upper levels, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something bigger was at play, and they had just uncovered the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Chapter 5: Moments of Closeness. James Teller stood on the edge of the Xanthian Gardens, his gaze drawn to the bioluminescent trees that swayed gently in an artificial breeze. Their faint, shifting colors were reflected in the still waters of a nearby pond. Jackson Reed leaned against a tree, tossing a small stone into the water and watching the ripples expand outward. "It's almost too perfect," Jackson said, his voice low. "No mosquitoes, no weird smells, not even a stick out of place. Like someone put all of this together just for show." James smirked. "Maybe it's just what happens when you have a few thousand years of practice. They've had a lot longer than us to get things right." "Yeah. But where's the fun in that?" Jackson tossed another stone. "It's like walking through a postcard. No surprises, no rough edges." James was about to reply when Lyra stepped into view. The faint glow of the garden seemed to catch in her skin patterns, creating a subtle halo effect around her figure. She carried a crystalline device in her hands, her expression as calm as ever. "James, Jackson," she said, nodding to each of them in turn. "You requested a follow-up analysis of the the data almost incomprehensible at first glance." "Seems complicated," Jackson muttered. "It is not as complex as it appears," Lyra said. She pointed to a particular line. "This fluctuation is the key. It suggests that the saboteur's device was designed to create a feedback loop within our energy grid." James frowned. "A loop like that would, what? Overload the system." "Precisely," Lyra said. "If it had succeeded, the resulting surge could have destabilized the core, potentially leading to a catastrophic failure." "Lovely," Jackson said, leaning in closer. "What's this here?" He pointed to another data set. "That is a secondary signature," Lyra explained. "It suggests there may be a second device hidden within the facility." James felt his stomach tighten. "So there's more than one saboteur? Or the first saboteur planted multiple devices?" Lyra said. "Either way, we must locate it before it is activated." Jackson gave James a sideways look. "Sounds like our job just got more complicated." "It always does," James said. The three of them fell into a comfortable rhythm as they reviewed the data together, their dialogue bouncing back and forth as they pieced together the puzzle. Lyra's technical knowledge combined with James's strategic thinking and Jackson's knack for spotting patterns made them an effective team. After some time, the data session wound down, and Lyra turned off the device. The garden was quiet now, the faint sounds of distant machinery a subtle background hum. "Thanks for walking us through that," James said. "It's starting to make more sense. Your efforts to understand our systems are appreciated," Lyra said, her gaze lingering on James. "It is not often that humans adapt so quickly." James shrugged. "We're just doing what needs to be done." Jackson stretched, standing up from his leaning position. "All right, I'll grab the equipment from our quarters. Be back in a few." James watched Jackson disappear down the path, leaving him alone with Lyra. The quiet settled in again, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lyra stepped closer. "I have observed something unusual about humans," she said, her voice softer now. "Your capacity for connection, your willingness to engage with others even under stressful circumstances, is different from how Xanthians interact." James tilted his head. "Different how?" "Xanthians tend to approach relationships methodically," she said. "We build trust slowly over time and rarely through spontaneous actions. But you seem to trust your companion implicitly." James chuckled. "Well, Jackson's had my back in some pretty tough spots. It comes with the territory." Lyra's patterns shifted faintly, a soft pulse of color. "And yet you are also willing to trust me, despite our differences. That is not something I have experienced often." He glanced at her, catching a flicker of something in her expression, something more than simple curiosity. "Well," James said after a pause, "sometimes you just have to take a leap." Lyra's gaze lingered on him a moment longer before she nodded. "A leap," Perhaps that is what I need to understand. Their conversation trailed off, but the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it was a moment of shared understanding, one that didn't need words to convey its significance. The two stood there for a while longer, side by side, as the bioluminescent trees swayed gently in the breeze. Chapter 6. The Hearing. The Grand Council Chamber was a cathedral of light and geometry. Towering, translucent walls stretched up to an arched ceiling, where luminous filaments pulsed in intricate patterns, casting shifting shades across the floor. James Teller stood at the center of it all, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding. The eyes of dozens of Xanthian counselors were fixed on him, their glowing patterns a subtle cacophony of muted color. Jackson Reed leaned close, his voice low. "Man, this place gives me the creeps. It's like being inside a giant alien kaleidoscope." "Keep it together," James muttered. "We've got one shot to convince them." Lyra stood beside them, her composure unshaken. Her patterns were subdued, her posture steady. She turned to James. "When the council addresses you, respond directly. Do not attempt humor or evasiveness." "Noted," James replied. "What's the first question going to be?" Lyra hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "They will ask why you risked yourselves to stop the saboteur." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "That's obvious, isn't it? They were trying to blow up your energy grid." "For you, perhaps," Lyra said. "But Xanthians do not typically intervene in such ways. They will want to understand the reasoning behind your actions." James straightened his jacket. "All right, I'll just tell them the truth." "Truth is relative," Lyra replied. "Present your actions as deliberate, not impulsive. They must believe you acted out of calculated intent, not emotion." Before James could respond, the council leader, Zidar, entered the chamber. The counselors all turned their focus to him, and the shifting lights above grew steadier. Zidar's voice, resonant and calm, filled the room. "Human envoys," Zidar said, "you have been summoned to explain your involvement in the recent sabotage attempt. State your case." James stepped forward, acutely aware of how small he seemed in the vast chamber. He cleared his throat. "Counselor Zidar, members of the Xanthian Council, we intervened because we recognized the danger posed by the saboteur. If they had succeeded, your energy grid would have been critically damaged. The consequences could have been catastrophic, not just for Xanthi, but for any future cooperation between our worlds." One of the counselors leaned forward. "How could you be certain the saboteur's actions would lead to such a result?" "We analyzed the energy signatures and compared them to known patterns," James said. "Our team determined that the device was designed to overload your core systems. Lyra can confirm our findings." All eyes turned to Lyra, who nodded once. The humans' assessment was accurate. Their swift intervention prevented a potentially devastating failure. Another counselor spoke, their voice tinged with curiosity. "And yet, your actions were unorthodox. You did not notify security. You did not request permission. You acted independently. Why?" Jackson stepped forward, his usual irreverence replaced by a surprising seriousness. "Because we didn't have time to go through the usual channels. The guy was about to activate the device. If we'd stopped to ask permission, it would have been too late." "And you chose to put yourselves at risk?" the counselor pressed. "Yes," James said firmly. "Because we saw the danger and knew we had the ability to stop it. We weren't going to stand by and let something like that happen." The chamber fell silent for a moment. The counselors exchanged glances, their glowing patterns shifting in a rhythm that James couldn't interpret. Finally, Zidar spoke again. "You claim your actions were driven by a desire to prevent harm. Yet your methods were highly unconventional. Some might even call them reckless." "They were effective," Jackson said bluntly. "You still have your energy grid. We made sure of that." "Indeed," Zidar replied. "But effectiveness is not always the primary concern. Xanthian society values order and deliberation. Your impulsive actions, while successful, challenge our norms." James stepped forward again. "Counselor Zidar, We understand that our approach may not align with your traditions, but this situation required quick thinking and decisive action. We acted not out of recklessness, but because we believed it was the only way to protect what matters, to protect Xanthi. Lyra's voice joined his. The humans' actions were unorthodox, but their intentions were clear. They sought to prevent harm and preserve the integrity of our infrastructure. That is a truth we cannot ignore. The council chamber fell silent again. James felt his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Jackson, who gave him a small nod. Lyra's patterns shifted faintly, as if she were steadying herself. Finally, Xidar spoke. We will deliberate and announce our decision shortly. You may wait outside. James, Jackson, and Lyra exited the chamber, the heavy doors sealing behind them. Jackson leaned against the wall, exhaling loudly. Well, that went okay, he said, looking to James. Hard to tell, James admitted. It's up to them now. Lyra stood quietly, her gaze focused on the closed doors. You presented your case clearly. That is all you could do. Yeah, James said, trying to sound confident. Now we just wait and see. Chapter 7, The Verdict. James Teller and Jackson Reed stood side by side in the antechamber of the Xanthian Council Hall, waiting for the decision that could reshape their mission. Lyra stood a few steps away, her gaze fixed on the closed doors in front of them. The air was heavy with anticipation, and even Jackson, usually quick with a quip, was uncharacteristically quiet. You think they'll go for it? Jackson finally asked, breaking the silence. James shrugged, trying to keep his own doubts from showing. Hard to say. They're careful. It's not in their nature to rush into anything. Yeah, I got that, Jackson said. But you made a solid case. They can't ignore the fact that we stopped the sabotage. Lyra's voice was soft but clear. The council values logic and caution. They will consider your actions carefully, but they may still see your methods as disruptive. Disruptive, Jackson echoed. We saved their energy grid. That's not disruptive. That's just good timing. Lyra glanced at him. To you, perhaps. To the council, it is a deviation from established protocol. Well, sometimes protocol needs to be set aside, James said. If we'd waited for permission, their core might have been destroyed. Which is why I supported your actions, Lyra replied. But the council is not known for its flexibility. The doors opened suddenly, cutting the conversation short. A Xanthian attendant gestured for them to enter. James took a steadying breath, then walked forward with Jackson and Lyra close behind. The council chamber was silent as they stepped in. The councillors were seated in a wide semicircle, their glowing patterns subdued. At the center, Xidar rose to address them. Envoys? Xidar began, his voice calm and measured. The council has considered your actions and the information you presented. We acknowledge the value of your intervention and the threat you averted. However, your methods remain a concern. Jackson leaned slightly toward James and muttered, Here we go. James ignored him, focusing on Xidar. Counselor, we understand that our actions were unconventional, but the situation called for immediate response. I hope that, in time, you'll come to see that we acted out of necessity, not disregard for your protocols. Xidar studied him for a moment before continuing. The council has decided to accept your explanation and recognize the merit of your actions. However, we urge caution in the future. Your methods must align more closely with our procedures if we are to maintain trust and cooperation. James felt a wave of relief, but he kept his expression neutral. Thank you, Counselor. We'll do our best to adapt to your ways while continuing to work toward our shared goals. See? I told you they'd see reason, Jackson said under his breath. Xidar's gaze shifted to him briefly, then back to James. Your efforts have prevented a potential disaster. For that, you have our gratitude. And now we must move forward. There is much work to be done. As the counselors rose from their seats, the tension in the room began to dissolve. James nodded respectfully before turning to leave, Jackson and Lyra following behind. In the corridor outside, Jackson let out a low whistle. Well, that wasn't so bad. I was half expecting them to kick us out or something. They don't operate that way, Lyra said. Their decisions are deliberate and measured. Once they reach a conclusion, they are unlikely to reverse it. James allowed himself a faint smile. It's a step in the right direction. We've earned some trust. Now we just have to keep building on it. Jackson clapped him on the shoulder. See? You've got this diplomacy thing down. Just had to save their bacon first. Lyra raised an eyebrow. I do not understand. What does saving bacon have to do with this situation? Jackson grinned. It's a figure of speech. Means we saved them from a big problem. Ah, Lyra said. Though her tone suggested she still found the expression puzzling. Your colloquialisms are colorful. Just part of our charm, Jackson said with a wink. James shook his head, but he was smiling. Come on. We've got more work to do. As they walked down the corridor, the tension of the past days began to fade. Their mission wasn't over, far from it, but they had made progress. James glanced at Lyra, who was studying her tablet as they walked, and at Jackson, who was already planning the next step in his head. For the first time since arriving on Xanthi, James felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Maybe, just maybe, they had a real chance to make this alliance work. Chapter 8. A New Dawn. The docking bay of the Xanthian Interstellar Station was alive with energy as crews prepared the exploration vessel for departure. James Teller stood at the observation deck's edge, watching as workers moved in perfect synchronicity. The sleek, crystalline hull of the ship gleamed under the bay's bioluminescent lights, a symbol of the cooperative effort that had brought them to this moment. Jackson Reed walked up beside him, hands in his jacket pockets. You know, when they first said we'd be part of a joint exploration mission, I thought they were joking. Now look at us, ready to chart unknown star systems with alien allies. Makes you wonder what's next. James smirked. If you'd told me this when we first got here, I wouldn't have believed it either. But after everything we've been through, it makes sense. We've come a long way. Yeah, Jackson said. Feels good, doesn't it? James nodded, his gaze shifting to Lyra, who was speaking with a group of Xanthian engineers near the ship. Her composed demeanor and quick mind had been essential in bridging the gap between their two peoples. Now she was a key member of the crew, and their guide into uncharted territories. As if sensing his gaze, Lyra looked up and approached them. Everything is proceeding according to schedule. The ship will be ready for departure shortly. Jackson grinned. You sure they don't need a few more weeks to polish the thing? I mean, look at it. Practically sparkles. Lyra tilted her head, her patterns shifting faintly. The surface material is designed to refract ambient light. It is not polished for aesthetic reasons. It was a joke, Jackson said, shaking his head. You know, humor? Lyra's lips quirked slightly, the faintest hint of a smile. Yes, I am aware of your humor. I am also aware that you do not truly wish to delay our departure. You got me there, Jackson said, chuckling. James stepped forward. So we're all set? Everything's ready? Lyra nodded. The final systems checks have been completed. The ship's propulsion and navigation are fully operational. We are prepared to begin the mission. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what lay ahead settling over them. It wasn't just another mission. It was the start of something new, something that neither humans nor Xanthians had attempted before. Jackson broke the silence. All right, before we head out, there's something I need to say. James raised an eyebrow. This isn't going to be one of your speeches, is it? No speeches, Jackson said. Just this, we've done some crazy stuff to get to this point. And I know things haven't always gone smooth, but it's been an honor working with you both. So let's keep it up and show the galaxy what we can do. Lyra looked at him, her expression calm but her patterns showing a subtle warmth. Your sentiment is appreciated. I too have found this collaboration to be worthwhile. James glanced at them both, feeling a sense of pride in their team. We've got a good crew, and we're just getting started. Moments later, the announcement came over the intercom. All crew, prepare for departure. The three of them made their way to the boarding ramp, where the rest of the team, both human and Xanthian, was already assembling. The mood was a mix of excitement and anticipation. James exchanged a nod with the mission commander, a senior Xanthian official who had been instrumental in pushing for the joint expedition. "Ready to make history?" the commander asked. James nodded. "Ready." As they stepped aboard the ship, James felt a rush of emotion he hadn't expected. The sleek corridors, the hum of advanced systems, the faces of the crew. It all hit him at once. This wasn't just about exploring new worlds. It was about proving that two vastly different species could come together and achieve something greater. Jackson's voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, you gonna stand there all day? Come on, man. We've got a galaxy to explore." James smirked and followed him down the corridor, Lyra walking beside them. The three of them made their way to the command center, where the large observation window offered a breathtaking view of the stars. The commander's voice came over the ship's comm system. "All stations, prepare for launch. Course is set for the designated sector. Engage propulsion on my mark." James, Jackson, and Lyra took their positions, ready to embark on their next adventure. The countdown began, and with each passing second, James felt the anticipation building. "Here we go," Jackson muttered. Lyra glanced at him. "Are you prepared?" "Always," Jackson replied. "And you?" "I am ready," she said, her tone calm. James smiled, looking out at the stars. "Then let's do this." The countdown reached 0, and the ship's engines roared to life. As they surged into the unknown, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer strangers in an alien land. They were a team, ready to face whatever lay ahead together.